Morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Heat Stress, Physiological Responses and Controls. I'm Andre Gauvin, and I'm an occupational hygienist for the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers. We do have a moderator today answering questions. He will be taking questions for the end, and I'll answer them as best as I can. So let's get to the basics here. So we're going to go through the basics of the temperature and how your body responds to changes in temperature, working in the heat, complications from heat stress, stress evaluation, Humidex heat stress response plan, and prevention guidelines and controls. So the principles of heat. So temperature represents the energy of a subject or of a substance or object. So the energy has the ability to flow from one place to another. So heat flows from areas of higher temperature to areas of lower temperature. And the body keeps its core temperature at around 37.5 degrees Celsius, plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So we have a thermal balance. So your body is divided into your peripheral temperature and your core temperature. So at different set temperatures, your body reacts differently. So if you look at a room temperature of 0 degrees Celsius, your peripheral temperature is lower and all the heat is contained to your core. As you increase the temperature, that core temperature kind of spreads out as you're starting to evaporate some of that heat. So again, you have heat gain versus heat loss. So if you have a heat gain that it's equal to your heat loss, your core temperature will stay the same. If you have a heat gain that is greater than the heat loss, your core temperature rises. And if you have a heat gain that is less than your heat loss, your core temperature will fall. So thermal regulation. So despite variations in temperature, humans can maintain a constant body temperature by balancing heat gain with heat loss. So humans can tolerate a decline in core temperature of 10 degrees Celsius, but only an increase in 5 degrees Celsius. So what happens when you get hot? So we have our hypothalamus, which is our human thermostat. So when your core blood temperature or your core temperature increases, it goes to your heat loss center and you have vasodilation of your blood vessels, decreased metabolic rate, you start to sweat and your hair is lowered. So these are all heat loss mechanisms. And then on the contrary, if your core temperature decreases, you try and have your heat gain mechanism. So now you have vasoconstriction of the blood vessels, increased metabolic rate, you start shivering and your hair on your skin is raised. So body heat content, so there is obviously daily variation, and you want to try and have a balance between your heat gain and your heat loss. So this is your homeostasis. So heat gain, obviously you're gaining heat with your metabolism. Your resting metabolism provides heat. Your muscular activity provides heat. Thermal effect of food. So as you're digesting food, you have a heat gain. The environment will provide a heat gain, and hormones. As for heat loss, the body has a thermal regulatory mechanism that protects against overheating. So there's 4 physical processes that contribute to heat loss. So that's radiation, you have 60%, conduction at 3%, convection at 12%, and evaporation at 25%. So as you can see here, this is just a kind of a good example. So you evaporate through your breath, you evaporate through sweat, you convect from the wind passing by you. You convect heat to the wind. You radiate heat because the air is usually cooler than your body is, and you conduct heat to the surfaces that your body is touching that are cooler than your body temperature. So during exercise, 80% of your heat is dissipated through evaporation. So that's during exercise or a heavy workload. So evaporation provides a major defense against overheating. So the body's surface contains approximately 2 to 4 million sweat glands, and during heat stress, the sweat glands secrete sweat. And it's usually a sweat that's filled with electrolytes. So evaporation of the sweat from the skin exerts a cooling effect. So it takes the heat from the body, takes it out to the sweat, and then the wind or the air cools the sweat and then cools your skin, and in turn cools the blood going into your tissues. So evaporation at high ambient temperatures. So as temperature increases, conduction, convection, and radiation decreases in their effectiveness to cool the body. And the reason for this, because if the air temperature is higher than the temperature of your body, then what happens is you're actually heating the body rather than having a heat loss. So in that case, sweating is the only defense. So you're sweating from your skin and your respiratory tract. So heat loss and high humidity. So evaporation of sweat is key. So there's three key factors that affect evaporative cooling. So that's surface exposure. So if you have somebody who's fully clothed rather than someone who has no clothing on, then obviously the person with less clothing will evaporate heat more effectively. And then you have your temperature and your relative humidity of air. And convective air currents around the body. So the more wind and convective air, as long as it's cooler than your body temperature, it will cool your body. So what is relative humidity? Well, it's a ratio of water and ambient air at a particular temperature to the total quantity of moisture that air could contain in percentage. So we use a hygrometer to measure this. There are other ways, but this is the easiest way. So it's important, what's really important here is sweat does not cool the skin, evaporation cools the skin. So the greater the humidity, the greater the risk of overheating. So factors determining physiological strain, so air temperature, relative humidity, individual differences in body size and fatness. If you have more body fat, you have more of an insulating factor there, and you're less effective in heat loss. The state of training, if you're more in shape, the degree of acclimatization, environmental influences such as convective air currents and radiant heat gain, intensity of the activity, and the type and color of clothing. So here we have a heat strain self-evaluation. This is something you could do if you know you're working in the heat. You can measure your heartbeat. So if you have a sustained heartbeat of 120 or 180 beats per minute minus your age, then there's a good chance that you're in a heat strain. If your body temperature is around 38 degrees Celsius, if your recovery heart rate is at 1 minute during rest is more than 120 beats per minute, if you have symptoms of sudden and severe fatigue, nausea, dizziness, or lightheadedness, workers may be at risk if they're sweating profusely for over hours. If they have a weight loss, significant weight loss in a shift of 1.5%, and if they're noticing less frequent urination. So working in the heat, we have physiological effects that affect the blood flow, the fluid loss, and core temperature rises. So blood flow in the heat. So there's a big danger here when it comes to exercise or work. The body will favor oxygen delivery to the working muscles over cooling mechanisms. So there's a dilemma here with your circulatory system. Faces the two demands of working in the heat. So your muscles require the delivery of oxygen through the blood, and the other demand is that your blood is diverted to the periphery to transport heat for cooling at the skin surfaces. And then if that's happening, then oxygen is not being delivered. So again, your body will favor the oxygen delivery, which means that your body is not dispersing heat as effectively. So fluid loss in the heat. So 1 hour of moderate activity produces a sweat loss of about 0.5 to 1 liter or more. So what happens is you have a fluid loss, it reduces the heat dissipation, it increases the heat storage, and increases the cardiovascular strain, and then decreases your work capacity because you're getting more fatigued. So hydration strategies, if you know you're going to be working in the heat, one of the biggest things I would recommend is hyperhydration. So you ingest extra water before your work in the heat, which offers thermoregulatory protection. So a strategy here would be 500 milliliters the night before working in the heat, and another 500 milliliters upon awakening, and an additional 400 to 600 milliliters 20 minutes prior to activity, and then consistent fluid intake throughout the day. So obviously you want to try and have a fluid balance. Anytime you're having a fluid loss, you want to try and intake as much as you are during that day. So consistent fluid intake throughout the day is important. So here are your signs of hydration. So if you're inadequately hydrated, you'd have infrequent urination, you're going to have excessive weight loss, you're going to have a strong odor of urine, and your urine color is dark yellow. And if you have adequate hydration, you're urinating frequently, your color is clear, the urine color is clear, and it's odorless. So these are all signs of hydration that you should keep in mind when you're working in the heat, or any time really. Electrolytes are important. They promote a more complete recovery during rehydration. It decreases urinary output, stimulates thirst mechanism, and restores plasma volume more rapidly. So here you'd be looking at drinking like sports energy drinks like Gatorade, Powerade. There's also packets that you can get to throw in your water, which are electrolyte substances. Another important thing is heat acclimatization. So your body will adapt to hot environments over time in several ways. So this includes improved cutaneous blood flow, effective distribution of cardiac output, lowered threshold for an increased sweating, more effective distribution of sweat over the skin, lower salt concentration of sweat, lowered heart rate for a similar activity level. So the thing is with heat acclimatization, it could take up to 4 to 7 days to fully acclimatize. When we look at the ACGIH TLV book, basically they're saying 5 of the last 7 or 10 out of the last 14 days to be fully acclimatized. If you are not acclimatized, then you should take more precaution. And acclimatization can be lost with removal from heat for 2 weeks. So if you take a vacation where you're not in heat, or well, you wouldn't be, anytime you take a vacation away from work where you're not actually working in the heat, you will need to reacclimatizing when you return to work. So those at higher risk, so you have people with lack of physical activity, poor physical condition, people who are overweight, people who are very young or very old, very small body sizes, people who are dehydrated, if you wear excessive clothing, if you drink alcohol, caffeine, or smoke, nicotine products, they're all at higher risk for heat stress. The occupations at risk is anybody who, or any occupation involving higher temperatures, radiant heat sources, high humidity, or strenuous physical activities. So obviously construction workers and outdoor workers are at risk. Iron and steel foundries, miners, brick and ceramic plants, firefighters, bakeries, smelters, anybody who has an oven or heat source, they're at higher risk. So here are the complications that can happen if your body's not able to cope with the heat. So we have heat rashes, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, stress or fainting, and heat stroke. So statistics show that heat waves claim more lives each year than any other weather-related exposures combined. So this includes hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes. According to the CDC, between 1979 and 2003, there were 8,015 deaths that were attributed to excessive heat exposure, which gives us an average of about 334 deaths per year. So heat rash. So this is what a heat rash will look like. It's an irritation of the skin caused by excessive heat and sweating. So the rash develops because your sweat glands are plugged. So it's usually enhanced by hot and humid environments. Your sweating and you have dirt that gets into your sweat, and then it clogs the sweat gland, and then it takes away the evaporative effect, and then you have these bumps, itchy bumps that develop. So this is a heat rash. So the treatment for this is to change into dry clothes and avoid hot environments, and rinse your skin with cool water. What that'll do, it'll hopefully rinse the dirt out of the pore, and then it will hopefully allow the sweat to come out. So heat cramps, they occur during or after physical activity in a hot environment. It's usually in a specifically exercising muscle. So if you're doing, a lot of lifting, you might have cramps in your back. If you're doing some work, some overhead work, it'll be in your shoulders and upper back, neck. The muscles that you're using are usually the ones that are going to be cramping. Your core temperature often remains normal. And the reason for the heat cramp is usually an imbalance in your electrolyte concentration. So again, it's important to have to replenish the electrolytes. And heat cramps can also be a symptom of heat exhaustion. So prevention for heat cramps would be a brief rest. So just take a break, drink those electrolyte containing drinks instead of water. This will also prevent water intoxication or just low sodium levels. And seek medical help if the cramps persist. So here are the symptoms you'll have with heat cramps. You'll have heavy perspiration, weak lightheadedness, and muscle cramps. Heat exhaustion. This usually develops in unacclimatized persons during the first heat wave. So it's usually caused by a large amount by a loss of large amount of fluids and electrolytes, and an ineffectiveness in circulatory adjustments. So there are warning signs here: heavy sweating, paleness, muscle cramps, tiredness and weakness, dizziness, headaches, you're very thirsty, nausea, vomiting, and fainting. So the treatment for this, again, is move to a cool area, loosen your clothing. If the person is feeling nauseated, make them lie down, offer sips of cool water, not too much. It takes at least 30 minutes to cool the body down after overheating. So make sure that they're in a cool area. If they don't start feeling better, get medical attention, and have somebody close who's certified in CPR, because the cardiac strain during heat exhaustion could inhibit a cardiac arrest, and the same with heat stroke. So you always want to make sure there's someone near. So heat exhaustion symptoms: heavy perspiration, dilated pupils, severe thirst, red or pale, cool, moist skin, lightheadedness and nausea. So heat stroke is the most serious and complex of the heat stress illnesses. Reflects a failure of the heat regulating mechanisms from an excessively high core temperature. So in classic form, your core temperature will be above 40 degrees Celsius. There's an absence of sweating, so you'll be touching a person, they feel very hot but not wet, and their mental status is altered, so they're in a daze. So there are two types of heat stroke. There's exertional heat stroke, which usually occurs in the individual or workers who engage in strenuous physical activity for a prolonged period of time in a hot and humid environment. And they often have impeded heat dissipation. So they're wearing clothing that maybe that isn't helping in heat dissipation. Non-exertional heat stroke more commonly affects sedentary elderly individuals, people who are chronically ill, or very young people. It usually occurs during hot environmental heat waves, and is more common in areas that have not experienced a heat wave in many years. So the progression, the body's no longer able to cool itself. So your basic heat loss mechanisms aren't functioning anymore. You have a high body temperature that could be above 40 degrees Celsius. It usually starts off with excessive sweating and then just moves on to no sweating and dry skin. Your skin is hot to the touch. So you have a fever but no sweating. You have headaches, dizziness, nausea, rapid heartbeat, rapid and shallow breathing. The person will be confused and irritable, and they may lose consciousness, and death is another progression, and hopefully it wouldn't get to that. So here are some of the main symptoms that you'll see with heat stroke. So fever, the skin will be red, they have very small pupils, rapid and shallow breathing. These are all signs that someone is having heat stroke. So the treatment for heat stroke is call 911 immediately. If you have someone else that, like certain workplaces call another emergency number, you make sure you call that number. You want to have immediate and aggressive cooling, so you fan them, remove their clothes, spray them with water, have some cold compressions. Don't encourage eating or drinking right away, especially eating. You can maybe give them a few sips of water here and there, but don't encourage it right away. Try and get them out of like where they're mentally alert prior to doing that. So now we need to evaluate heat stress. So how do we do that? So the ACGIH has this table that you can use to evaluate. So basically you're going through, you're evaluating the hazard. You're seeing if the clothing inhibits sweating. Is there a TLV that's been exceeded? Is there data available for detailed analysis? So now we're getting into assessment and measurement. And then if there is, okay, based on this data, are we safe or are we not? So we want to try and control. We implement a control, and then we continue to work and we monitor the conditions, and then we reevaluate to see if our controls are working. So there are TLVs. So these apply to nearly all heat acclimatized, adequately hydrated, unmedicated, healthy workers who are reportedly exposed or repeatedly exposed without adverse health effects. So it's based on preventing the worker's core temperature from rising above 38 degrees Celsius, which would be a heat strain. So we're trying to keep the workers with the TLVs, we're trying to keep the workers away from the lowest possible heat stress or form of illness, which is heat strain. So the ACGIH developed a method for assessing heat stress based on a wet bulb globe temperature threshold. So what is a wet bulb globe temperature? So that's a measurement of the environment that to heat stress. So it includes air temperature, radiant heat, and humidity. So your air temperature is just your normal temperature. Your radiant heat is your globe temperature, which is the black ball, and your humidity is the natural wet bulb and your normal temperature together. So there's two ways to calculate the wet bulb globe temperature. So you have the calculation with solar load and the calculation without solar load. So here are the TLV and action limits for heat stress based on the wet bulb globe temperature in Celsius. So if you don't have a wet bulb globe temperature thermometer, then it's pretty hard to follow these. So what we have is a heat stress toolkit, which has a Humidex heat stress response plan. This is based on the ACGIH TLVs, where the wet bulb globe temperatures was translated into Humidex, and it's based on moderate workload and unacclimatized workers. So what is a Humidex? Humidex is a Canadian invention to combine temperature and relative humidity into a single number so people can tell how hot it feels. So for example, if it's 26 degrees out and you have a 60% relative humidity, it's going to feel like 32 degrees Celsius. So how do you measure the Humidex? So we have the natural wet bulb and dry bulb from the thermometers, which are the most accurate, but not everybody has this with them. So you'd have to convert the readings to relative humidity and then convert the relative humidity to temperature and temperature to the Humidex. So we have a calculator on our website that you can use that will do this, but the easiest way is just to have a hygrometer. It gives you your relative humidity, and then you would have your temperature, and then you would just plug these numbers into this table, your the Humidex heat stress response plan, and it'll give you your Humidex. So this is all part of the handouts. So you'll have this in your handouts. So here's an example. If your temperature is 29 degrees Celsius and your humidity is 65%, well, your Humidex is 38. So then you would go to your action. So you see 38, 39 would be 15 minutes per hour relief. And then we have a response plan here as well. So if we go back to our example of 38 degrees Celsius, so we would provide 15 minutes of relief per hour, provide adequate cool water, at least 1 cup of water every 20 minutes. And workers with symptoms should seek medical attention or get the rest that they need and step away from the heat. So this is just a monitoring a table, and it's a good plan that you guys can use. So there's also adjustments for clothing. So clothing can limit sweat evaporation, which causes the body to heat up. So this results from less airflow between the clothing and the skin, making sweat evaporation difficult. So the TLV is based on wearing long sleeve cotton shirts and pants. So when clothing hinders evaporation, values need to be added to measured temperature, which is based on the WBGT. So here, this is again from the ACGI TLV book. So the TLV is based on your work clothes, just cotton long sleeve shirt and pants, which adds 0 to your wet bulb globe temperature. So you're adding, so if you have a double layered woven clothing, then you're adding 3 degrees Celsius. If you have polypropylene coveralls, 0.5 degrees. Polyolefin coveralls, it's 1 degree, and then limited use vapor barrier coveralls. So these are like big Tyvek suits and things like that. You would add 11 degrees Celsius. So you can see that people in these suits are at much higher risk than anybody else. So you really got to watch for that. So protective face masks and thermal regulation. So this has been a topic that's been a little more popular since COVID-19. So it's something that we've had questions about. So protective masks, we're looking at N95s, air purifying respirators, and surgical masks. So they can negatively impact respiratory and thermal mechanisms of human thermal regulation. So how they impair them is through convection, evaporation, and radiation process. However, it's only a relatively minor increase, but it is something that you need to keep in mind. So if you have workers that normally don't wear face protection and now they are wearing face protection, it's just something to keep in mind that they may need more breaks or longer breaks. So adjustments for radiant heat. So if you're working outdoors in direct sunlight between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., you should add 2 to 3 degrees Celsius to your Humidex. And the same thing indoors. If you're working next to a radiant heat source, you got to use a common sense to add the 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. So it would be the same as comparing to the amount you'd receive from the sun. So heat stress prevention. So we'll go over engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. Engineering controls, what we're trying to do is reduce the heat at the source. Obviously, you can't do this for outdoor workers, but for indoor, we can try and control at the source by, adding insulation, blinds on windows to prevent the sun from coming in, exhaust hot air or steam, any radiant shielding from a radiant source, adding ventilation, general and local air conditioning. That is usually for environments that are difficult to cool. So if you're working next to, a furnace, for example, then you want to try and have local air conditioning for the controllers. And then air conditioned rest breaks for people who are working outdoors. Utilize cooling fans if the temperature is below 35 degrees Celsius. If it's anything above 35 degrees Celsius, you're actually heating the body. Actively cool the body with misters, and if you can, use less labor-intensive tools. So administrative control. So the biggest thing is you want to try and minimize worker exposure and increase recovery time. So have an established and enforced heat stress policy. Control your internal heat generation, so reduce your workload, increase the frequency of rest breaks, or have workers perform lighter duties in cool areas. Assign extra workers to those jobs. Schedule strenuous jobs in cooler times of the day. So before 10 p.m. would usually be your more strenuous work. And ensure good nutrition and rest. So have, for your snacks, for lunch, you can have fruits and vegetables. They offer, hydration and electrolytes. So these are good to have. Train your workers to recognize early signs and symptoms of stress or of heat stress. Provide accessible drinking water to encourage your workers to drink cool water every 15 and 20 minutes. So even if they're not thirsty, you want to make sure they're drinking. Have a buddy system so that if your workers are trained on signs and symptoms, they can kind of, assess themselves and develop a hot weather plan, such as a Humidex. So personal protective equipment is the last line of defense. Obviously, you want to do administrative or engineering controls first. So if it's appropriate, you can wear light summer clothing. In a case of high radiant heat, reflective clothing should help. Cooling vests are also a good tool. For very hot environments, there's water or ice-cooled insulated clothing that could be considered. So the thing is with protective clothing, it can also inhibit the sweat evaporation due to the lack of permeation. So in turn, this could increase the body's internal temperature and thus cause heat strain. So vapor barrier clothing also increases the heat stress on the body. Like I showed you earlier, it actually, you need to add 11 degrees Celsius to the TLV or to the WBGT. So extra caution should be taken in a heat stress evaluation anytime that they're wearing protective clothing. During breaks, you should make sure that they remove the protective clothing to improve sweat evaporation and reduce body temperature. Have active or passive cooling during the rest. So have like some misters or air conditioners that they're able to cool in. Replenish fluids in the body as much as possible. So these are all important. So in summary, prevention is the best form of treatment. So learn the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, monitor yourself and your coworkers, block out direct sun or other heat sources, use cooling fans and air conditionings, and rest regularly. Drink a lot of water or Gatorade or sports drinks. Wear lightweight, light-colored, and loose-fitting clothing, and avoid drinking alcohol or caffeinated drinks. This will actually dehydrate you. So what to do for a heat-related illness, call 911, or if you have another emergency number, you would call that one. While waiting for help to arrive, you should do the following. So move the worker to a cool shaded place, loosen or remove heavy clothing, provide cool water, sports drinks to the worker, and fan and mist the worker with water. So it's really important to never ignore anyone's signs or symptoms, no matter what the temperature, Humidex. Ignoring the signs and symptoms in the early stages will result in progressively increased danger. So make sure that if there's anything that you're reporting it to your supervisor, or if you're the supervisor that you're noticing it, you pull the worker out of the work and get them the rest. So thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can.
Okay, well, Andre, you've got some already. The first question, you touched on it briefly, but what effects would wearing a non-surgical level 1 mask have on heat exhaustion while working in a factory around 35 to 40 degrees Celsius?
That's pretty specific. I would have to do a bit more research on that in terms of how it would increase your stress, the stress on the body, but it will increase. Like if it, just having a face mask, if you're not normally wearing one, it's something that you should consider looking at it and trying to evaluate more closely. So the only way to really know is by doing regular testing and like checking your temperature, monitoring your temperature regularly to see what the effect is. Um, so, like a way to do that is to have, an ear thermometer at the workplace, and you can check your temperature every 20, 30 minutes if you're working in that. And this should be done if you're working in 35 to 40 degree temperatures. This is already like the monitoring should already be done. This is something that you should be, looking into. Um, just to protect yourself from heat stress. A lot of times, you might be acclimatized already, so your employer may say, well, you're used to working in these conditions, but if now you're introducing a mask, you should start monitoring more regularly.
Okay. The next question is, how can I evaluate different rest breaks for different workloads?
Well, that would be if you're looking at a heavy workload or a light workload. So if you look at the Humidex response plan, there is like in the handouts that I gave you guys, there is something for light, medium, heavy, and very heavy workloads. So by assessing that, it'll tell you how much calories or how much energy you're burning. So you can do a bit of an assessment that way. But again, these are all specific that to the work itself. So it's really depends on a lot of things. Like what's the heat output? Is it or how hot is it that day? What's the humidex that day? Those like if you follow that humidex response plan, it'll really gauge what kind of work you should be doing, whether it's light, medium, or heavy. If you're in, so let's go back here to the humidex response plan. If you're in the yellow or the red, or orange or the red, you should stick to, lighter or moderate, not even moderate, I'd say light work. If you're in the white or the yellow, you're pretty safe. It's just you got to look at warning signs, and have more water. But in the white, you're safe for any type of work, I would say. So as you're getting into the higher temperatures, then you should start looking at more controls and lighter work.
Okay, the next question is, are there any specific studies on workers such as fire and police who must wear heavy PPE for long periods to address the heat effects, and at what temperatures they may start to experience decreased mental acuity?
There are some studies out there. I would have to look at those. If you want to send me an email about that, I could probably provide you with a few of them. I don't know them from the top of my head, but I do remember seeing them.
Okay, and I'll provide your email address in the chat box in a moment. Would athletic clothing, for example, moisture wicking fabrics, help mitigate heat retention? And would wearing it under uniforms help?
Yes, they do, because they actually remove the sweat from the skin. So any wicking material helps remove the sweat from the skin, and it makes it easier for the convection to remove. So to dry your skin, right? So what that does, it helps dry your skin to the point that you can cool your body. So again, if the problem with convection is if the air outside is warmer than your body temperature, then it doesn't matter, right? Whether you have a wicking material or not. But I would say it's better than just wearing a cotton clothing because it keeps your body dry. And there are research papers out there stating that.
Okay. For many chemical contaminants, there are calculations that should be considered when adjusting a TLV for extended shifts. Is there a similar consideration for heat stress?
There is. Okay, hold on. What's the question again here?
For chemical contaminants, there are calculations that should be considered when adjusting a TLV for extended shifts. Is there a similar for extended shifts? So is there something similar for heat stress?
For heat stress, no, there isn't. That only applies to the chemical. So for heat stress, the adjustment factor would be in your clothing, not in the time.
The next question is, are heat rash and prickly heat the same?
Prickly heat, I'm not sure. Heat rash is basically just like a bunch of red little dots. So I don't know what prickly heat is. I haven't really looked at that, but I can take a look at it and see. So again, if you want to send me an email about that, I can take a look into it. But the heat rash is basically a clogging of your pores. So where your sweat glands, if they clog with a bit of dirt, and then you're not able to sweat or to evaporate your sweat, then it becomes a rash.
Next question is, on slide 47 and 48, which temperature gives the 26 degrees, and which bulb should they refer to?
Okay, the 26 degrees would be your which ball that's just your regular air, which would be your air temperature, and your humidity would be your natural wet bulb. So that would give you, these two together give you your relative humidity. And that's where it gets complicated when you're using a wet bulb glow temperature. So you would enter all of those into, so you wouldn't be using the Humidex. If you have a wet bulb glow temperature, I would not use the Humidex response plan. I would use the ACGIH TLV limits. But if you don't have a wet bulb glow temperature, which most people don't, then you can have just a hygrometer, which is this, and enter it into this table, and it'll give you your Humidex, which will be your heat response plan.
Okay, next question is heat acclimatization period, is heat acclimatization period consistent or varies with different geographical regions, tropics or subtropical countries like India, where the relative humidity is more than the 60%?
That's something I'd have to look into. Most of the research that's here comes out of the United States and Canada, so I would think maybe in terms of acclimatization, but your body will adapt, right? So acclimatization is to whatever heat your body is exposed to, and then you will be, if that's the normal temperature that you're getting in India all the time, then I would think that your body would acclimatize to that. But that's something, again, that I can't say for sure. I would have to look into that a little more.
Okay. Next question is on slide number 54, you mentioned adding 2 to 3 degrees to the Humidex. Do you mean adding the 2 to 3 degrees to the existing existing environmental temperature measured?
Yeah, so if you measured 26 degrees and 60% relative humidity, and you have so we'll take that example and we have 32 degrees, so you would add 2 to 3 degrees to that 32 degrees, so you'd be at 34 or 35 degrees Celsius in a Humidex.
Okay. Is it applicable to use the Humidex in the presence of high metabolic rates or workloads?
Um, well, it is because it still affects your body in the way that your body will react. Um, the Humidex response plan is a preventative tool, right? So you're seeing this so that you can gauge what type of activity you should be doing and how long you should be doing it. So if you're looking at intense activity and your Humidex is very high, if your body's not used to that, I would not do I wouldn't complete that type of training or that type of work. Um, you want to once your body is acclimatized to that temperature, then you can increase your intensity of the activity. It's usually how it works.
Next question. With the variance in weather in Ontario, can a worker ever be considered acclimatized? We normally do not have 17 to 14 days of the same temperature.
That's the hard part for outdoor workers. When you're looking at miners and indoor workers, that are working near furnaces and stuff, they do get acclimatized. But for outdoor workers, it can be difficult, and that's where it's important to look at signs and symptoms and have a buddy system and have controls in place because they're not always acclimatized.
Okay. Next question. Is the ACGIH heat stress guideline less protective than the cow Humidex?
Well, the ACGIH or the Humidex response plan is based on the ACGIH, so I would say no. And we hold this, but it's Oshko that did the research on this. It's an American group, but it's all based on the WBGT ACGIH TLVs.
Okay, and that's the last question. I just asked if there's, here's another one. Are there guidelines for closed, no windows to open spaces for office workers?
Well, for them, it would just be to have air conditioning. I would say for guidelines, control because that if everything is closed like that, you can really control the temperature. So controlling the temperature would be the best bet.
And Andre, what is the ideal temperature for office workers?
23 degrees is usually good. Um, 23 to 24, so that people are comfortable.
Okay. Is there any qualitative difference between men and women workers regarding the ability to acclimatize?
That's a good question. I'll have to look into that. I'm pretty sure it's very similar. There may be slight differences, especially because of hormonal differences, but that would be the only thing. So depending if the person is going through menopause or not, or if they're pregnant, or like women may have a harder time in that sense. Um, but those would be the slight differences, and then obviously there's other factors like age and if you're overweight or so we went through some of that earlier. But yeah, these are all factors that come into play.
Okay. Next question. In terms of calculation, the wet globe thermometer does not seem to take into account of intraday variation, especially for outdoor workers. Is there a way to calculate the dose, and should the dose even be calculated?
Well, there is no dose when it comes to heat because everybody has a different thermal regulation, right? So if you can get out of the heat for 10 minutes and you're fine, you go back into the heat. So it's not really dose rated. Um, so let's go back to the wet bulb globe temperature here. So you're looking at solar load and without solar load. These are the types of calculations you would have. So what you would do is take multiple readings during the day to get your average for that day. But again, there's no dose or anything.
Okay. Another question was, could you review the slide regarding the mask used in the workplace?
Yeah. Where did I put that one? So here we have So basically, this is a slide that for the protective face mask. So there is a research paper out there, but they found relatively minor increases um, with the use of masks, which was N95s, air purifying respirators, and surgical masks. It was they said there was impairment because of convection and evaporative processes and radiation processes. So as you're breathing out, you would evaporate sweat, but now it's staying in the mask, and then that heats up, and then you're kind of breathing in hot air again. Uh, so that was part of it. But again, it was minor increases. So if you're not used to wearing with a mask, because again, people get acclimatized to that, right? If they're working in those areas and they're wearing masks all the time and they're used to doing that, then their body will react to that, and eventually you will be able to handle that. But if you're not used to it and you introduce these masks, then it's important to keep an eye out for that, and maybe give more rest breaks, and give them some time to recover.
As a follow-up, Andre, to the question regarding the dose with the wet bulb thermometer, the question was, so if we don't calculate the dose, how long should the monitoring be conducted? Or more accurately, which part of the day should the temperature be taken for comparison against the index?
Well, for the part of the day, it would be you should do it more than once. That's usually when it comes to temperature. As the temperature increases, you should keep taking it, because temperature changes. It varies throughout the day. So in the morning it's cool, in the afternoon it's hot. It might be dry, and then all of a sudden it rains, and then it's hot and humid. So these are all things that you got to take into account. So it's not just one time in the day. It's any time that you feel that the temperature may have changed, then you would take another reading.
Next question is, what is UTCI, and is it helpful for heat stress?
UTCI. What is UTCI? Which is, I'm not sure what they mean by UTCI.
Just waiting to see if they're still on, if they're typing a response.
Yeah. I don't think I had that in the presentation anywhere.
It's the Universal Thermal Climate Index. It's an assessment of the thermal physiological effects of the atmosphere environment.
I'd have to look more into that. I can't comment on that. I'm not that familiar with it, so that's something I'll have to look into.
Okay. Next question is, what is the standard effective temperature set? Was that in your presentation?
The standard effective temperature?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the temperature would be, it's an energy, right? So the effective temperature would be that it moves from from a hot area to a cool area. I don't know what else you mean by that question, but that's all I could say. So it works the same way with the body, right? So if your body is warmer than the air, your body is giving off heat to the air. But if the air is hotter than your body, then the air will be giving off heat to your body. So that's where the radiation, convection, and conduction is hindered if the air is warmer than your body.
Okay. I think you've already touched on this, but this question is, what is the applicability of the ACGIH TLV or Humidex for people in a tropical climate? Would you expect additional adjustments to the existing standard?
I wouldn't expect any adjustments other than you're working in the direct sunlight, so you would add your 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. If you're in the shade, then it would be the same. If you're in, because it would be the same even if you're in a tropical area. Your body would become acclimatized, and then you're monitoring the same way.
Okay, follow-up is, why is that?
Well, that's basically because of your acclimatization period. I would like if your body is acclimatized to that temperature, then um, it's just like, for us being up north, if we go south and in the winter, for example, we're here, we go south, we're in shorts and t-shirts, and we see people in coats. So it's kind of the same thing, right? Your body adapts to that temperature to the point where, okay, your thermal regulation system is normal, so that even a slight drop in temperature, a slight increase in temperature, you might need, more clothing or less clothing. So for us, from going from north to south, basically from the northern hemisphere to the equator, you see a big difference there in temperature. So we are, we're in shorts, we're in t-shirts, whereas locals from the area are often in like fully clothed and sometimes wearing coats. So this is, if your body is acclimatized to that area, you would you would then treat it the same way. Thanks, everyone.